Good evening, and welcome to our second part in an 8-part series on religious freedom, religious liberty. This evening we are going to cover the topic of history of religious freedom in America. We're going to have to move fairly quickly. There's a lot of information, and even with that, we're only just skimming the top of it. If you would, let's have an opening prayer before we begin. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you that we can come and meet together this evening, study about how the history of our country was formed, how it associates with our religious freedom as we know it today. And we want to thank you for that, by the way. We pray that you'll guide us through this now and that we will gain some new understanding as it relates to us in our present day. In Jesus' name, amen. So as a brief introduction, just to give you an idea of where we're going to be heading through this whole topic, our history, as you all know, is quite varied. Our nation was founded and influenced by many factors, as we covered in the last session that Pastor Doug covered. We have quite a bit of influence by European history as it accounts for our governance. Also, at the founding of our country, we're going to look at some of the aspects that were associated with geopolitical and social influences and how those still have a profound effect on what occurs with regard to our understanding of religious freedom, we as a nation, and us as individuals as well. And I think it's instructive that we observe these influences in the context of when they occurred. And there are ebbs and flows that we're going to be looking at as we go through this topic to see how it's influenced our nation and where we are today. And I hate to say it, as much as I would say this is a country that we enjoy the most freedom of any country on earth, it's not all a pretty picture. There are quite a few things that, while it's portrayed through rose-colored glasses, there are some less than ideal circumstances that occurred through our nation's history. So a couple of things on the background. Unfortunately, we can't cover all of the history. It would take several sessions. That's why we have history classes for school. But there were multiple major world powers that were involved in the motivation via conquest, trade, among other things. In fact, some people refer to it as the 3 Gs: God, glory, and gold. As you can see up here, we have the Spanish settlers and their influence over on the western United States into Mexico, also here in Florida. They were mainly their settlements were focused on serving the crown. As far as that goes, there is still influence within the West and Southwest and even parts of the rest of the nation that are influenced today by that culture. Likewise, the French settled, and by the way, both are Catholics, both the Spanish and the French were predominantly Catholic, also served the crown. They had a lot of influence in the Louisiana Purchase region. There was obviously conflict between them and Great Britain in what you see is highlighted for the United States. One exception, which we've spoken about before, and I won't take any more time than to just briefly mention this, but Fort Caroline, 1564, settled by French Huguenots. That is not the only settlement that the Huguenots made. There were at least two other settlements up the eastern coast. But as we've talked about, I think Pastor Doug mentioned in one of his sermons, they were massacred by the Spanish. It's already a major conflict at the very beginning, religion against religion. Moving on to what we're really going to focus on this evening, and unfortunately it's not to diminish these other two cultures and their influence on our founding, is on the English settlements and primarily the 13 colonies. The reason for that is a lot of the give and take that occurred in the founding of our nation had influence from the English background. We will be looking at a fair number of settlements, but we won't be able to cover all of those. So, as I mentioned, on the religious influences, the Catholic Church And I want you to think about this as we go on. We won't necessarily highlight it and pound it in as we move on, but the Catholics, as far as the European, all the European nations were concerned, it was not only a religious entity, but it was actually a political power. And as we study in our in prophecy, we have associations that are associated with revelation and impure worship and things of that nature. And believe it or not, we're not the only ones that have the corner on those beliefs as far as impure worship. There were individuals back in this time and day that also studied Revelation and had association with regard to that as well. And as we will see, there is influence and motivation for why individuals are very concerned about Catholics settling in our nation. They were excessive and abusive in their power. The Anglican Church, England, as you know, we won't go into any more there, broke away from the Catholic Church, formed their own church. It was a state-sponsored church, and in that, there were government provisions and tax dollars associated with it. They also were very discriminatory towards other faiths. So then we come to the Puritans and the Separatists. We always think of the Pilgrims coming in 1620. By the way, they actually made attempts back in 1597 and a few other attempts that were ill-fated and basically have disappeared from history. They were seeking religious freedom for themselves, but unfortunately denied for others. If you're a Puritan, you're great. If you're a Separatist, you're great, but you need to be a part of that. Lastly, the Spanish and French influences we've already mentioned that we'll have to just dismiss with them. That will have to be on your own. So religious influences. Before we completely forget about them, the Native Americans or indigenous people had practices of their own. As best we can tell, they didn't really have a lot of conflict with regard to those aspects, but of course, when settlers arrived, we had an intolerance for their practices. We thought we knew better and we needed to convert them. Additionally, for all the different sects and different religions that showed up, it pitted Catholics against Protestants and even Protestants within their various sects against one another. And I already mentioned the Huguenots and the up around the Jacksonville area. So settling in around the New England area, which is, again, where we focus mostly on the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the Plymouth Colony, the Separatists, to keep things straight, were actually the Pilgrims, whereas the Puritans were actually associated with the Massachusetts Bay Colony. As I mentioned, you're good as long as you're one of them, but not so much if you're not. New Amsterdam and New Netherlands, or as we know them, New York City and New York, were originally Dutch, and while the Dutch weren't just overly tolerant, they were more tolerant than most people in that day. And so you can see that there were quite a number of religions that found ability to settle in that area and feel comfortable. They felt that there was a tolerance or needed to be a tolerance for individual beliefs. And of course, there was also the Dutch-sponsored Reformed Church. In Virginia, which we'll find was really driven, a lot of the founding fathers had the strongest influence originating from Virginia. The Church of England, or the Anglican Church, was a state-sponsored church at the beginning with Virginia. Moving in that same area, we look at Maryland, the name Mary, Queen Mary. That originally started out as an area where Catholics could settle. And Lord Baltimore is associated with that area. What turns out, and we won't be able to focus much more on this either, but Maryland actually, while being settled by Catholics, eventually Protestants came and outnumbered them and started to make laws that actually repressed Catholics. So while they were originally settled that way, it became discriminatory even in an area that was carved out for them. So we're now going to move into actually some people that actually moved the needle, as I'd like to say, with regard to influences on where we are today, and actually where our founding fathers actually obtained probably some of their thoughts. Roger Williams, Rhode Island, originally was a Puritan. In fact, he started out in England, came over to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, was actually a preacher in that colony, but due to sedition and heresy, he was driven out in 1636. A couple quotes that I'd like to mention, and it's really helpful. There are quite a few quotes. We're going to try to make it through this evening to really ponder these. God requireth not a uniformity of religion to be enacted and enforced in any civil state. If you think about that, God doesn't need our help. That's the first thing that came to mind when I read that statement. The second, forced worship stinks in God's nostrils. God's looking for freedom, will to be able to love him, and that speaks deeply as well. And then separation of church and state. Hedge or wall of separation between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world. So you can be, we read also about being of the world but not in the world, the garden and the wilderness. He believed that the government should concern itself not only with matters of civil order, that they should only, rather, concern themselves with matters of civil order and not with religious belief. In fact, he took the Ten Commandments and he basically said the government has nothing to do with the first tablet. The second tablet is where government's responsibility is at. Rhode Island became the first haven for multiple faiths. Many of the ones that you saw previously in New Amsterdam were associated and came to Rhode Island. Interestingly enough, and this was not known until I was researching this, but the First Baptist Church in America, 1638, started by Roger Williams. William Penn came a little bit after Roger Williams and was a Quaker associated with Pennsylvania. Turns out he and his dad did not see eye to eye. I believe his father was actually an admiral in the Navy, and King Charles II owed his father a debt. Well, his father passed away, so William Penn was the recipient of that. As a part of the founding of the colony in 1681, William Penn was very interested in the support of unifying the colonies, not being separate, but actually working together. He favored a lot of democratic principles that were put into place in the Pennsylvania government, and a lot of those proved to show up in the Constitution in 1787. You again can see the different religions that felt they were comfortable in the Pennsylvania colony. So another interesting thing, prison reform. There was debtor's prison at the time. He was very much in favor of a progressive manner in rehabilitating people that wound up in prison. Government, he felt, was derived from the people, not from a single power, not from a religion. And some other interesting things that are noted is he organized two houses of government, similar to our House and Senate, and that he felt that there needed to be limitations on a sovereign power, which in some regard I would associate with the presidency. One last thing that you did not see on this chart, he was enough of a forward thinker that some of the ideas that he presented manifested themselves very much in line with what we recognize as the European Union today. He thought that would be a way to handle differences of opinion within the European nations peacefully. So from an aspect of Christian and secular nations, this is a little bit of a rundown of what we're going to break down the rest of the discussion on. Our nation obviously was founded by many believers that believed in God. Their backgrounds were very different. Question is our nation Christian or is it secular? Well, if we go through this, and I want to make a pause here and just say one thing. If you have time, and I have not yet, but to go through them, but the Federalist Papers are an excellent opportunity to read and gain an understanding of what our founding fathers, what was going through their minds when they were looking at all this. I'm going to tell you right now, what we're looking at is the best that I could glean, the best that other people could glean from what we believe were their thoughts. But I would encourage you to decide upon your own, of your own accord, and look at those. For the areas that we're going to look at, these men that were of our founding era they were men of their times, so not all their thoughts were original. We're going to look at some of the basis where we believe some of their thoughts came from. Some of the prior influence came from European influence. Some of that influence came from religious practices, again, the Catholic and the Anglican Church. Some of that came from the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. Then we're going to go through and look at the various periods referred to as the Great Awakening. We mainly refer to the First and Second Great Awakenings, but there's also some people argue that there may have been a third and possibly a fourth Great Awakening. And we'll try to get through and explain how those had influence on our nation as well. And then we see in God we trust, and we see under God in our pledge. We're going to see when those came about in our nation's history as well. So the First Great Awakening. The church had become very formal, very stale, and there was a lack of any individual or personal relationship with God. In that, this also established a disestablishment struggle. People wanted to break away from formal religion in the sense of ceremonial aspects. We have the Enlightenment. Enlightenment with regard to the thinkers there. A lot of this became scientific and logical views of the world. People started to study nature. Coming out of the Dark Ages, people were starting to look at how things worked. What was the cause? This actually led to a lot of secular thought and gave rise to what was called secular rationalism. John Edwards, which is one of the famous preachers from that era, you probably have seen Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Maybe not the way that we normally would think about salvation now, but he at least was a proponent of justification by faith alone. Another prominent preacher that I do not have listed here as well was also George Whitefield. Thousands of people would come out and hear him preach. There were new beliefs that were developed in terms of religious liberty based off of these colonies, and these influenced especially Madison and Jefferson. There were efforts that were involved with establishing protection for multiple religions. This is about the time that Baptist and some other religions started to become more options, if you will, for congregants. The message of salvation, that salvation was through Christ alone, also became prominent in this time. And it generated a deep personal association between individuals that attended these meetings, and also a very strong emotional response. Because of the because of the Enlightenment, thinkers started to talk about individuals and the importance of individual rights. And in that became equality and an opportunity for equality. And the ideas of nationalism and individual rights are believed to may have been fostered further by this Great Awakening as well. The First Amendment, and I'm going to save any discussion particularly on that, lest I steal any thunder from Jeff Bromley, who'll be giving another talk on that particular topic. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of a religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. If you go back and look at how many different revisions of this simple statement, powerful statement, but simple statement, it is amazing. Looking through that, there were at least 10, maybe 15 or 20 revisions to get to this. Thomas Jefferson on the Statute of Religious Freedom. It is meant to comprehend within the mantle of its protection the Jew and the Gentile, the Christian and the Mohammedan, the Hindu and the infidel of every denomination. It's pretty clear that he thought it was protection for everyone. Another statement, but it does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or there is no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. No harm to the individual. His three proudest achievements, and this is interesting after being President of the United States, and these are on his headstone at his grave. The Virginia Act of establishing religious freedom, which, by the way, served as a basis for a lot of what was then brought into our founding articles. The writing of the Declaration of Independence, and the founding of the University of Virginia. John Adams, who was a friend and then was not a friend, and then they became friends again towards the end of their life. In the Treaty of Tripoli, there we find this statement: the government of the United States is not, in any sense, founded on the Christian religion. George Washington, and this was addressing a synagogue via letter. All possess a like liberty of conscience and immunity of citizenship. For happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens. James Madison, and I find these to be the most, just resonate with these statements. Who does not see that the same authority which can establish Christianity in exclusion of all other religions may establish with the same ease any particular sect of Christians in exclusion of all other sects? The United States is an asylum to the persecuted and the oppressed of every nation and religion. And I have no doubt that every new example will succeed, as every past one has done, in showing that religion and government will both exist in greater purity the less they are mixed together. Pretty clear on separation of church and state. Finally, Christianity disavows a dependence on the powers of this world. For it is known that this religion both existed and flourished, not only without the support of human laws, but in spite of every opposition from them. Very similar to the statement by Roger Williams. Christianity has existed before, and it can go on existing without assistance. The Articles of Governance. Just to point out a few things here, these all came between the years of 1776 and 1788. The Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson, along with others that served as an editorial basis, there is no appeal to God or authority or power given to religion in the affairs of men in this document. The Articles of Confederation from 1777. Ben Franklin, Silas Deane, Josiah Bartlett, and John Dickinson were the main authors here. No authority is provided to religion, and it gives the first glimpse of separation of church and state. James Madison, in relation to the U.S. Constitution in 1787, there's Article 6, which references the no religion test. That is the only religious reference there, no reference to God. And finally, the Federalist Papers. John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison were all authors. No mention of God or Christianity, and the only item pertaining to religion was the intent for separation of church and state. So all of these individuals, by all means, were not of like mind, quite different, in fact. And thankfully so, I will have to say, at least my personal opinion. There was quite a bit of back and forth that went on. You had Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Anti-Federalists were focused on states' rights. Federalists wanted a more centralized government. When the Constitution was drafted, Anti-Federalists stated it failed to safeguard individual liberties from the federal government. Patrick Henry, George Mason, Samuel Adams, and Eldridge Gary refused to sign based off of this. Thomas Jefferson thought the Constitution would provide too much power and authority to the presidency. So then the Articles of Confederation, they provided limited federal authority. Patrick Henry felt this was an adequate form of government. He was satisfied. There was still, based off of the colonial heritage, though, a resentment for that centralized power that they had associated with many of the European countries. Patrick Henry tried to defeat this Constitution. He was really battling James Madison, and this disagreement brought about the Bill of Rights. And it turns out James Madison, by the way, was not in favor of the Bill of Rights to begin with. He did not think they were necessary, but lo and behold, he became the author. Based off of influence from the Virginia Declaration of Rights and Declaration of Independence, those were authored, and Alexander Hamilton, ironically a Federalist, opposed the Bill of Rights on the basis that they were not needed. He thought they were not of any need. Our form of governance, was arrived at through extensive, thoughtful, probably should have put argumentative, debate to finally arrive at compromise. The Second Great Awakening, and don't get too hung up on these periods. Different people discuss different times when these periods maybe were associated. What I've placed in here are more of the periods that are associated with the actual evangelical aspects, or the evangelism, I should say, aspects of this. But there were after effects that some people even, for instance, in the Second Great Awakening, indicate maybe extended even through the Civil War. The primary focus was soul winning, and anyone could achieve saving grace through an inner and outer struggle against sin. Making America fit for the second coming of Christ. Where does that sound familiar with? By the way, next week, Pastor Doug is going to be talking about the basis for the history within the Adventist Church. This Second Great Awakening is when people that founded our church began to get their ideas. This is where that swell came from. It initiated several moral and philanthropic reforms, including the temperance movement and the women's emancipation movement. There were close ties between Protestant churches and American culture, and this actually led to some social and political reform. A lot of it was good. Several colleges, several seminaries, mission societies were all founded. A great outcome. Such items as social work, schooling for poor children, the abolitionist movement. They were primarily supported by Quakers, Methodists, and other faiths of that type. Again, Seventh-day Adventists came out of this movement, the Church of Christ, the Disciples of Christ as well. We're going to come back to some bad things, actually, that came out of this era, unfortunately, as well, later in the talk. As we transitioned into a more mature nation, we had the 14th Amendment that was ratified in 1868, and this was later cited by the U.S. Supreme Court as justification for application of free exercise, not only at the federal government, but also at the state and local government. In God we trust. For those that grew up in my era, it's always been. But this actually first appeared in 1861 and wasn't adopted as the national motto until 1965, based off of the 84th Congress. It was incorporated in 1861 to pacify the National Reform Association, and I won't bother reading that for you if you want to scan over it a little bit, but these individuals actually wanted to change the preamble of the Constitution. There was a feeling that the Civil War had originated because the nation had removed and become an ungodly nation due to slavery, and they wanted to establish the nation as associated with Christianity. So this was basically a bone thrown to that group. President Eisenhower, for where we see under God in the Pledge of Allegiance, that came about in 1954. If you think about what was going on in the 50s, we had just completed not only World War II, gotten into the Korean War, and there was a fear of communism, and even in our own country, and this partly was a reaction to those concerns. Some religious affiliation of founding fathers. And as I said earlier, this is what people can surmise from what they've read on what these individuals have written. I will say, for instance, as you can see in the list there, George Washington is listed there as a Christian deist. George Washington actually attended an Anglican church, and based off of that note was noted as being an official member, but based off of many things that he wrote in terms of beliefs and whatnot, he's actually understood to be more of a Christian deist. To give a little bit of understanding, if you're not familiar with what deism is, it's the belief in the existence of God solely based on rational thought. And that actually had a lot of influence with regard to Enlightenment in the period. And as you can see, we have represented here Anglican, Presbyterian, Congregationalist, Catholic, non-Christian deist, Christian deist, and Orthodox Christians. I think it also goes without saying, it's amazing that all of these individuals could actually meet and compromise on all the aspects that they had to discuss in the founding articles of our nation. Third Great Awakening. This occurred after the Civil War, and the shift was from an emphasis on personal to social sin. Some of what came out of this was poverty was not a personal failure. It was a societal failure, and it was rectifiable by the state. There began to be a secular interpretation of the Bible. Some good things that came out of this were expansion of secondary and higher education. There were labor reforms, civil rights, women's rights. And then as far as there was a conscious cooperative effort between Protestant churches to alleviate the urban industrial society, the plight of individuals that were associated with that. And it's debatable about the influence of this period. Some people don't even really recognize that this period existed. And there's further debate as to whether the Fourth Awakening existed. I didn't bother going into any more detail, but people normally associate that with the 1960s and 1970s and Billy Graham. Religious test. We already noted that the 6th article requires that there not be a religious test, but that doesn't mean that there hasn't been an informal societal religious test. Exclusion of Catholics. Until the nomination of Al Smith in 1928, there had been no presidential or vice presidential candidates that were nominated, only Protestants. In 1960, John F. Kennedy broke through that barrier and became the first Catholic to be president. Religious dissension among Protestants. There were early attacks on deist religious convictions. Thomas Jefferson, by the way, when he ran for the presidency in 1800, he was pitted against John Adams. John Adams, as you saw, was a very staunch Christian. Many people thought Thomas Jefferson was an atheist, an evil atheist for that matter. If you think that political campaigns are very dogged nowadays, 1800 was one of the most vicious ones. Thomas Jefferson was accused that if he were to become president, that he would come and burn everyone's Bibles, among other things. There were also, as we've noted more recently, a test of, are you really born again? Are you following the correct religion? If you think back to Mitt Romney and his candidacy, there were questions about whether he was of a proper faith. There are rare exceptions to this. For those of you that remember when Joe Lieberman was a vice presidential candidate, Lieberman made no qualms about that he was an Orthodox Jew, and he talked openly about his faith. And from the best that people can tell, I would tend to agree as well, it didn't seem to have any influence on his political achievements. So now I want to go into a few things that I would consider to be, unfortunately, really low points in our history of U.S. religious freedom. Nativists, in a response to pluralism. So you noticed the references to the quotes, George Washington, this is supposed to be a pluralistic society, James Madison, basically a haven. But between nativist and pluralism, there was quite a bit of concern within those that were within the country and those that were coming into the country. So there was this Protestant version of America in the 19th century. In the response to that immigration, there were throngs of immigrants coming in, Irish, Germans, etc. Irish with regard to the potato famine. There were other influences with regard to the reason why so many Germans were immigrating at that time. But it began to cause an imbalance, and people began to be concerned that there were too many Catholics, again, coming into the country. They're concerned about what their allegiances were, whether their allegiance would be to the Pope. By the way, there were concerns actually early on, and even through up to Kennedy, going back to that briefly, as to whether a president could isolate their religion from dictation from the papacy. And John Kennedy famously addressed that in his campaign. In 1850, actually, Catholicism was the largest single American denomination. Later, many Jews came and became citizens as well. Unfortunately, because of this, an anti-Catholic and anti-Semitism feeling came over the country. And since that, the founding of the nation, there were few Catholics and Jews in America. They just weren't well represented, as you saw in the early indications for the 13 colonies. The sudden demographic change generated a fear and really a stronger than just an anxious aspect within some Protestants. The Know Nothing Party began here in an effort to actually repress these groups. Not only were they trying to exclude them from politics, there were also actual violent acts that occurred, burnings, beatings, killings that were associated with discrimination of these two groups. Unfortunately, even into the late 19th century and the early 20th century, there were also, again, strong influences with regard to anti-Semitism and that opposition to immigration. The Ku Klux Klan had existed before that, but it gave it even stronger rise and dominance during that period. Another thing I want to briefly mention, since we have a few minutes, I think we're making good time here. About the same time that we talked about the Second Great Awakening, Joseph Smith and the migration, they were continuing to evade or move away from persecution. And ultimately, Joseph Smith was murdered. In that context, the state of Missouri was very repressive of that religion. They ultimately wound up in Utah. Moving on to some brighter points. African American churches. African American churches have played a really central role in political and societal aspects of African Americans, even going back to the colonial period. They have helped shape our country through both moral and political leadership. A lot of what we associate probably culminates in the civil rights movement. Judaism and minority religions. Around the 20th century, there were houses of worship that actually supported these minority religions: Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, Jewish, and Buddhist immigrants. They're also at the forefront of progressive movement in the progressive era in the early 20th century. Unitarians and Quakers and Reformed Jews have been active in peace movements and advocated for social justice. Separation of church and state while maintaining a role in religion, there's been the ability for people to actually practice their faith and participate in government. There's a key difference there between trying to force a religion into government and being an open Christian or a person of another faith and actually participating in government. By so doing, these individuals have been able to benefit our country by actually demonstrating moral leadership and espousing their values. Unfortunately, our nation has also been injured by religious groups that overstep that bound and go more into the enforcement mode. So there's some key points of contention that I'd like to touch up on, and then I'll wrap up with one last quote that I'd like to share with you. There are polar opposites in the view of religion and public life, and those are competing right now. We see it many times over. Those who seek to establish in law a Christian America, and those who seek to totally exclude any religion from public life entirely. Neither one of those are representations of religious freedom in our country, as at least I personally know it, nor as I see it in what our founding fathers seem to say in their writings. There's also an aspect of teaching religion and teaching about religion. The difference comes about in a manner of advocacy and indoctrination, or whether it's an awareness of religion. Fortunately, many states have gone to mandating teaching about religion in a manner of social studies. And in 2000, the United States Department of Education actually sent a packet out instructing public school principals on the manner in which religious liberty rights should be taught to students, how they should be informed of their association with public schools and religions within the communities, and the role of religion in their curriculum. Thankfully, textbooks have also gone about including more stories about religious liberty. I can tell you that when I studied history, there wasn't a lot that was talked about in terms of our religious freedom and our religious liberties, and it's a very important woven into the fabric of our United States history. With that, I would like to read to you the Williamsburg Charter, signed in June 22, 1988. This actually was signed by Neil Wilson, the father of our current president of the church. And let me just read this for you. We affirm that a right for one is a right for another and a responsibility for all. A right for a Protestant is a right for an Eastern Orthodox, is a right for a Catholic, is a right for a Jew, is a right for a humanist, is a right for a Mormon, is a right for a Muslim, is a right for a Buddhist. And for the followers of any other faith within both the premise and the promise of democratic pluralism. The First Amendment, in this sense, is the epitome of public justice and serves as the golden rule for civic life. Rights are best guarded and responsibilities best exercised when each person and group guards for all others those rights they wish guarded for themselves. So with that is only scratching the surface, and I appreciate you enduring. If you have any questions at this point, I'll open up the floor. We have a mic back here if you'd like to ask any questions. I may not be able to answer them, but collectively we may be able to.
Can you say a little bit more about this Williamsburg Charter? Who provided that?
You'll note, well, maybe you won't note, because I failed to mention it earlier, but this was signed on the 200th anniversary of the Virginia signing of the Religious Liberties and Freedom Act. In choosing to sign this, they met in Virginia. There were members of business, there were members of government, there were religious organizations, a truly pluralistic representation. And I believe there were over 100 signatories associated with this document. The basis was basically to reaffirm what they believed our country was founded upon and what they wanted to I shouldn't say reestablish, but reaffirm. Yes? We can pass the mic around if somebody wouldn't mind walking it over.
Thank you. Yes, in the very beginning, you mentioned something called Christian Orthodoxy, and I think Samuel Adams and several other well-known founders were part of that. What is Christian Orthodoxy? What did you mean by that?
Well, I probably should have researched that more. I don't know that I really have a good answer for you. They tended to be more of the most affirmed in their religion. I think I mentioned that John Adams was one of those.
I think it was Orthodox deism, not just what it was.
Well, there was a Christian deism, and then there was a non-Christian deism. There's that distinction. Non-Christian deist really almost has no association with a formal being. They're about the closest thing you can come to, that at least what I would equate with what we would term an atheist now. They still use the rational aspects of understanding, but comparing that with a Christian deist would actually affirm that there was a God and that he set the world in order, essentially, but that everything else from that point came through rationalization. Thomas Jefferson is famously noted as excising from his Bible what he didn't care for, and basically, I will say they didn't really affirm miracles. There were other things of that nature. If it could not be reasoned in their mind, that was not part of their religion. Yes.
Some people seem to think that to be against Christian nationalism is to be against Christians and Christianity. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so to maybe restate it just one more time, make sure I catch what you're...
Some people think that to be against Christian nationalism is to be against Christians
Right.
and Christianity.
Okay, well, in a sense, I guess as far as I see Christian nationalism, it tends to be more of the closest alignment going back to what we talked about earlier would be nativism. In a nativism perspective, it was a concern for protecting what was one's own freedoms. It was too focused on I rather than we. And in the sense of when I becomes a large contingent, you can protect more freedoms. But by doing so, you've basically pushed everyone else aside. That, in a sense, I don't mean to call anyone that may be associated with what you may be referring to as Christian nationalism as non-Christian, but it does kind of contradict what I believe Christ stood for. And in that case, I do not believe that you can't be a Christian and be against Christian nationalism.
Because Christianity asserts freedom for others to believe as they wish.
Absolutely.
And Christian nationalism does not allow that.
That unfortunately appears to be the case. And I will say this is not a new occurrence. That's part of the reason why I put all of that in this package. We've struggled as individuals. We struggle about protecting what is us, and the other guy, well, he can fend for himself. Unfortunately, when it becomes collective in a government, the little guy can be left out. So, yes.
So after your reading, I thought that was interesting about "In God We Trust" and "Under God." What do you think, based upon your study of what the founding fathers of America in their principles, do you think they would have been, I know this is speculative, but do you think they would have been for or against putting like on all our currency "In God We Trust" and having these overt references to God, given that they left God out of some of those documents that they made?
I would say as a collective whole, they probably would have been against it. There are actually indications that I didn't put in here where they were against when prayer came up in a public setting. There were circumstances that were spoken to there. I will say part of the reason why I said thankfully that they were at odds with one another, there were members within that group that wanted us to be not a secular nation. And in my opinion, by the way, we are a secular nation. But they found common ground in protecting individual liberties while also allowing for religions to exist. There's another extreme that could have been reached, which is to not have protected any religion. And that was definitely even affirmed by the probably most extreme deviating away from Christianity. They also noted that there needed to be protection for those rights.
They did say, though, and this may go back to the deist, that as far as they would go in the direction of religion, they did say that they believed that we were endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are liberty and right to liberty and justice and happiness and so on. So.
Yes, and I will say terminology used like that tends to give people an indication to believe that they believed in a higher being. To the extent to which that was, there are circumstances where in some of the writing that was nothing more than a formal addressment, like saying ladies and gentlemen. In other instances, it was an affirmation of there was a higher being. Again, I'm referring to what people have ascertain from all of this. The basic premise is they were not trying to in any way say that by that there were rights privileged to the nation via God. So, yes.
So there was another question that
Online.
came in online.
Okay.
Gary, would our forefathers be just as tolerant for quote-unquote all so-called religions such as Scientology or others such as Church of Satan? Or how about church practices such as snake handling? Do not know the answer, just asking.
Actually, all of those, other than Satanism, were mentioned in some of the texts that are reviewed, and actually a few of those, by the way, just as a quick aside, were believed to come out through that third awakening. But anyway, that's a good question. I would being that some of that did not exist in any remote form in their day, it's kind of hard to judge them through the prism of today. I will say, from what I've looked at from what Thomas Jefferson had to say and what James Madison had to say, which, by the way, they were strongly influenced by people like John Locke and other philosophers of the day. I would have to say, out of all of those, maybe those two would have said, yep, that if it doesn't harm me, it's all good. I think that, and we did not get into religious practices that actually put people under trances or expose them to drugs and things of that nature. We've had instances where it starts to cross the line between we're protecting your religion, it's okay what you do, but now you're actually potentially doing something that could harm the collective good of the community. And that's where religious freedom the individual protections start to be removed and the civil authority starts to come into play. So I think they would be challenged, but it is hard to say for sure. It's a provocative question. Yes.
As they were drafting the documents, do you think they were pulling from their own experience, or did they have a bigger world view looking at other cultures and religions to help influence their final decisions?
It's again based off of what I've read. I would say that there was a strong aspects of observation even before their actual lifetime as to what had happened in Europe. There was a strong observation to what forerunners of theirs, like Roger Williams and William Penn, had established. They also saw what was happening in their own colonies before they founded things, and they realized that they could wind up establishing the exact same thing that many people left England for. For a while, Virginia was really hanging tight to being an Anglican church, state-sponsored, and then people begin. Part of what the awakening influenced, by the way, another factor there is you started having these other religions develop, and they said we don't need these individuals from this church to work in our behalf anymore. And they said, why are we sponsoring it anymore with taxes? And so there were influences of that nature. I also think, going back to the Enlightenment, there was as much as the Great Awakening of the Second Great Awakening actually reacted in some regard to fear of that secularism, it was actually kind of a convenient balance, as best I can read. You had the strong aversion to what was the past, and the Enlightenment influenced that. And then coming to studying things, people probably overshot, or the pendulum swung, and started to get into too secular of an idea. And then we have the Enlightenment come along, or the Great Awakening rather, and kind of bringing things back, and then swinging back across. And I would say between all of these, there have been pendulum swings throughout our history. But all of those factors definitely influence them. And without the balance of conflicting ideas, John Adams, by the way, and Thomas Jefferson couldn't have been more polar opposites. They were just, but yet they were friends. Unfortunately, about 10 years before that 1800 election, they kind of fell out. Thankfully, they came back together and both passed away in 1826 on July 4th. So it is amazing when people come together and actually compromise what can be established versus what may have happened if it had just been one thought, one idea. Another question?
Actually, it's not a question as much as it's a comment.
Okay.
The reference in the Declaration of Independence to the Creator, some people today may be tempted, to think that that's the Christian basis for the country, but it was really, in the context of the times, it was a refutation that human rights came from the king or the pope,
Right.
or the government. It was saying this is more universal, and it's not necessarily Christian because you have other faiths that also believe in a creator,
Right.
not just Christians. So I just would observe that it's not a good argument to say we're a Christian country because the creator is referenced in the Declaration of Independence.
Well, if there are no other comments, we're actually, you've got another one? Go ahead.
I would like to thank you for your presentation. I've learned a lot tonight that I guess the diversity of views that existed among the so-called forefathers, and what we hear on the radio or television or see on YouTube or whatever, seems to me there's a lot of misinformation that tries to say that, it was all Christian in origin. And it's interesting to break that down and see the breadth of diversity that was involved there. So I thank you for your presentation.
Well, thank you. And actually, that is a good point that I wanted to leave everybody with is, as I said, with recommending reading the Federalist Papers and that the observations that I've made, this is based off of my own reading. If you really want to get down and understand where we've been, you need to do a lot of reading, and you need to start from the beginning. You can then determine for yourself what you really think. But this, at least, is a presentation from what I believe the perspectives are that are associated with that. I appreciate that. So with that, we are past the top of the hour, and we should wrap up. I'd like to thank those that were able to join us online, and if you would, let's close with a word of prayer as well. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you again for being with us this evening. We appreciate the opportunity to come here freely, of our own will, to actually, when we want to come together and worship, to worship freely. We thank you, although by sometimes strange and odd ebbs and flows with regard to how history has manifested itself, that we have been able to be in a country that is actually founded by people that are willing to compromise and find a common point of good for governance and establish a basis for freedom of practice of religion to one's own conscience. We pray that you'll go with us now and bless us this evening, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.